The rise and fall and rise again of the military seaplane. Once seen as the future of aviation, seaplanes are now mostly forgotten relics of early aviation. But a new monster seaplane suggests these aquatic aircraft aren't dead yet. By Alex Hollings. At 10:18 a.m. local time on July 26, 2020, a massive amphibious aircraft pressed its hull through the waters of the Yellow Sea. Called the AVID AG600 Kunlong, which roughly translates to fish dragon, the seaplane's four powerful WJ6 turboprop engines soon whirled with enough force to drag the 121-foot aircraft and its 100,000-pound airframe up and out of the water, held aloft by its impressive 128-foot wingspan. The Chinese-made aircraft, now officially the largest amphibious aircraft in the world, bears a striking resemblance to the aerial-aquatic mammoths of a bygone era, when flying boats and floatplanes